So the two travelers are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And we don't exactly know where Emmaus is. It's kind of a generic name for a town. But as they go, they're discussing everything that had happened that weekend. This was Passover week, so it was a big week if you were a Jew. And the fact that they're going along and talking about these things is completely expected. The ancient sages and rabbis would say that when you travel along the road together, make sure that words of Torah, or God's teaching, pass between you. So they were just doing that, except they were trying to understand this crazy weekend. Now, we can say a little bit about these two. Cleopas is known to us. He gets another mention in the book of John in chapter 19, though there's a spelling difference. In John, he's Clopas. Now, because we don't want to be here for about an hour and a half, I'm not going to explain to you how that all works, but we'll just say that when you take Hebrew or Semitic names and pull them into Greek, the vowels get very mixed up. It's a pain, but there it is. But there's something about Cleopas that he gets identified in a weird way. And as one guy always says, pay attention to the Marys. I'll leave that as your homework. But later on, and in fact a pretty early Christian writer identifies Cleopas, and I think he's actually right, and I didn't know this until Friday, that Cleopas is actually the brother of Joseph, like the Joseph and Mary Joseph, which makes him Jesus' uncle. That blew my mind. So they're talking about, evidently, his nephew. And the person traveling with him, most likely, it's generally accepted that would be his wife. And so they're talking about all of this. And apparently they had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And so when Jesus comes up to them in disguise, how was that work? How was he disguised? I have no idea. Jesus as a resurrected body is very strange, and I have no explanation for it. They express their disappointment, and they're also shocked because they're like, did you just get into Jerusalem? Did you not spend any time there or talk to anybody? Everybody is talking about this Galilean guy, a hometown boy for us, who was executed by the temple elite and the rulers, who everybody knew were corrupt. But they identify him as a prophet, in mighty in word and deed. They recognize that this guy was a miracle worker, and they had high hopes for who Jesus was going to be. They said they had hoped he would be the one to redeem Israel. That was the hope. Now, one of my favorite passages about people hoping that Jesus was going to redeem Israel comes a little later in Luke part 2, which we would know as the book of Acts. So Jesus, he has been resurrected. He is standing before his disciples. He is about to ascend into heaven. And one of his disciples comes up and says, Jesus, is it now that you're going to restore the kingdom? And you can hear Jesus go, come on. I'm standing here. God raised me from the dead. And you're still stuck on that? Because everybody's hope was that Messiah would come in. He would kick the Romans out, establish the kingdom of Israel like the ancient days of King David and Solomon. He would reform the temple, remove the corrupt leaders who were skimming money off the top like crazy. God's Shekinah, or his manifest, tangible presence, would return to Mount Zion, and Israel would be vindicated. That's what they hoped Jesus would do, not get betrayed by his own people and killed by the Romans. So when Jesus comes and says, well, what are you guys talking about? And their faces are downcast, they are expressing disappointment. And if you listen carefully, I think also frustration. They had these hopes for what God was going to do amongst their people and in their lives. And that's a really, really important lesson, because disappointment is always going to be part of what it means to follow Jesus. I realize that's kind of a downer, but it's true. There will always be times in our lives when we are sure that this is what God is doing. This is where God is leading us. This is where, He has divinely ordained this moment, only to have that moment collapse and everything goes wrong and you are left with way less than you originally had. And you're finding yourself wondering, God, this is not what I thought we were doing here. I picked up everything and I've moved my family across the country to this job that this was going to be amazing and it was in your will, and then it's terrible and it's bottomed out and now we just don't even know what's true anymore. For what it's worth, that's not a reference to me moving down here. I realized that the first time I said it, I was like, wait, hold on. But we find ourselves going, what we thought this was this marriage or this relationship, this was going to be good. This was in your will, God. This is where we were headed, only to find that everything was disappointing. Everything was frustrating. Nothing worked out. And we are left going, God, I thought you had something else in mind. This is not okay. In the same way that Cleopas and his wife were going, we thought this was the guy. We know he was a prophet. We had high hopes. This was Passover. And now he's dead. They are stuck in Good Friday. They are stuck in a death and a burial. And that's it. That is their perspective. And the funny thing about disappointment with God is that God's perspective of our lives is very different from our own. If I think about my life and my perspective on my life, I look back, all the years leading up to this, and I look kind of in my immediate, existence, and I can maybe draw some conclusions and guess this is what God has in store for me, and he's going to lead us this way and that way or whatever. But if history is any indication, I'm a very bad guesser at where God is actually going to be leading me. But also, my perspective is tiny. It is finite. And if you think about the way God looks at your life, he doesn't just look at this moment. God in his infinite wisdom sees your life from your birth to your death and beyond. God sees your life as a whole. He sees the stories that he is weaving together into it. He sees this greater plan, that all of our lives are being woven together into this huge tapestry, the story that he is telling throughout human history. But my perspective is this. And the funny thing about perspective is that when it is like this, we almost never see the big picture, and that is incredibly disappointing and frustrating. By way of example, I got it into my head when Katie, my wife, was pregnant with our son, Nash, that I wanted, as kind of a gift to my son, I wanted to paint this big mural of Calvin and Hobbes, in this tree, and I kind of had this idea in my head, and I was like, I'm going to do this. This is awesome. The only problem, and this is serious, the last time I had painted for any kind of artistic reason was probably finger paint in kindergarten. And that's not an exaggeration. I'm not visually wired. Visual spatial stuff is actually very hard for me. And I like to think of it as that whatever spot in the brain that is, mine has a rock in it or something. It just doesn't work. But I was like, you know what? I might as well have an audacious goal and fail gloriously. So I am good at Photoshop, and so I pulled some stuff off the internet and kind of arranged it and made sure it worked. And then I went out after putting it off for a long time because I was like, I don't even know how to paint, and went and spent all this money on paint at Home Depot and came. And then my church at the time had a projector that you could hook up to your laptop, and you use that for teaching or presentation type stuff. So I checked it out for purely church-related stuff and came home. I don't do that now, Pastor C, don't worry. or something, and set it up in his room and turn on the projector, only to realize, like, based on the image that I was getting, this projector was assembled in like 1980. It was bad. I could barely get some sketching out and took a pencil and had to do a lot of erasing. After getting like the basic outline, I realized I'm just going to have to try and draw this, even though I cannot draw. So I'd kind of run down and look at my laptop screen and come back and draw a little bit and start applying paint just to try and get this moving, and I was frustrated. And so the first picture I've got here, this is what I saw. Like, you see it's kind of dirty, and some of that's because the picture is bad, but you can maybe start to see like a little bit of the pencil sketching and a little bit of the paint. And I'm standing there on this step stool, and I'm just getting angry, really, because I was disappointed and I was frustrated. This is not turning out how I wanted it. And then there was all this shame, like, how am I going to explain to Katie that I spent all this money on paint and this is a nightmare? I was disappointed because that's all I see. It's just what I'm working on, where I'm at, running down and trying to make sure I knew the spot, in this picture, and this is just not working. Until finally, there was a moment where I took a step back. I don't know why I did it, but I took a step back, and if we could have the next picture, then I could see that, and that's actually the same picture. And I thought, hold on, that's actually starting to look like something. I was as shocked as anybody else. All it took was just to be pulled away from that tiny little perspective, to start seeing the much bigger picture. And then in the encouragement that maybe things aren't quite as bad as my tiny little perspective saw, to show you the final product, it actually turned out. I will never paint again. It is not worth the blood pressure medicine that it took to not have a stroke, because wow. But it actually turned out, much to the shock of me and everybody else that knows me. It worked. And the thing I needed was just a little perspective. You can go ahead and take that down. It's kind of weird having that look down on me. Jesus, as he comes up to Cleopas and his wife, starts to draw them out a little bit, because they are stuck in a death and a burial. They are stuck in Good Friday. That's what they can see. And so then Jesus comes along and he starts explaining some things. He opens up the scriptures. And boy, we would love at least even the cliff notes of what he was talking about. But we can kind of guess that the entire Hebrew scripture narrative is really God wanting to dwell with his people. That's what Genesis 1-3 is about. That's what the prophets are railing on. All of the kings leading up to King David and Solomon is really the building of the temple and God's presence among his people. And lo and behold, what do you have as Jesus walking there along the road? That is God's presence with us. Emmanuel, God is with us. So he starts opening up the scriptures, and what he's really doing is pulling Cleopas and his wife back, because they are stuck in Good Friday. But Sunday is always coming. And as he pulls them back, he starts to open their eyes so that they can see that maybe God has something else in mind. That the disappointment and frustration that we feel is just one single solitary point that is part of a much better and much more redemptive story that God has in mind. And so they arrive at this village, and Jesus is pretending like he's going to keep going. And this is a culture that very much values hospitality. So it would be very shameful if the couple did not offer him lodging and press him. But there seems to be more. They're urging him strongly. They want to hear more. And so Jesus says, okay. And in the least covert reference to Holy Communion that I can find in the New Testament, what does Luke say? That their eyes were opened at the breaking of the bread. Wink, wink. But what they really saw was that while they were in the moment of Good Friday, a crucifixion, a death, and a burial, Sunday was on its way. Resurrection was coming. And that is a critical moment in the life of following Jesus. Because we may feel stuck in a death on a Friday evening, a burial, where that's all we see. Our perspective is fixed, and it is tiny. But God is a God who always redeems. Jesus' death and resurrection was not just a historical event that started this church institution thing. This was a cosmic event that echoes and ripples throughout all time. That when we are baptized into his death. We are raised in new life. So the promise that has been made is that even when we find ourselves on a Good Friday, buried and dead, Sunday is always coming. God will always redeem. God will always work death into new life. It may not feel like it at the moment. It may take what feels like a lifetime to get there. But that is the promise of Easter. That whatever we are disappointed in, whether it be God and our circumstances, our relationships, ourselves, that God is still raising the dead within us. And Sunday is always coming. Now, there's a pastor in New York named Tim Keller who I think put it really well. And I'll paraphrase it a bit and I'll repeat it because it's one of those things that you kind of need to hear a couple of times, or maybe just me because I'm a little slow. But he said, roughly, you would give yourself what God has given you if you knew everything that God knew. So I'll say it again. You would give yourself everything that God has given you in your life if you knew what God knows. Because as God weaves the stories of our lives together, we may experience a Good Friday, but God is the God that always redeems. Now that might raise some really uncomfortable questions. Because, would I actually give myself cancer? Yeah. Would I give myself a failed marriage? Yeah. Unemployment? Yeah. Hunger? Yeah. Broken family? Yeah. An economy that tanked? Yeah. The loss of skill and ability? Yeah. Missed opportunities? Yes. Because those are all Fridays where something died and is buried. But God, the master storyteller, has a moment of redemption in mind. It may take a lifetime to get there, but the promise of Easter, the promise of Jesus coming up to this disappointed and frustrating couple and walking along and opening up their eyes to the greater picture that God is doing, is that even if we are in Good Friday, Easter is always coming, because we follow the God that raises the dead in this cosmic moment. That means that God is raising the dead within us, and that our stories, as tragic as they might be, as tragic as we might be, as disappointed as we might be with ourselves, that story will always be a story of redemption. Because that is the story that God is telling in Jesus. May we find ourselves walking with Cleopas and his wife, honest about our disappointment and frustration. Because the promise is clear. When we are in our Good Friday moment, dead and buried, Easter is always coming. Let us pray.